What would you do if you discovered something that defied every law of nature you ever knew? In the winter of 1976, two bodies were found in a remote cabin outside Leadville, Colorado, and what the medical examiner discovered would shake the foundations of everything the investigators thought they understood about human biology. This is the story of the Duarte brothers, and the mystery that remains unsolved to this day. It was February 14th when Sheriff Tom Blackwood received the call. A local hunter named Raymond Pierce had been tracking elk through the mountains when he stumbled upon an old mining cabin half buried in snow. The door was ajar, and something about the silence surrounding the place made his skin crawl. When he pushed the door open, the scene before him would haunt him for the rest of his life. Two men lay on the floor perfectly still. They were positioned almost peacefully, as if they had simply lain down to rest. But Raymond knew death when he saw it. The bodies showed no obvious signs of trauma. No blood pooled on the wooden floor, no weapons nearby. Just two men, frozen in time. He didn't touch anything. He backed out slowly, his breath forming clouds in the frigid mountain air, and drove straight to the sheriff's office. Sheriff Blackwood had been serving Lake County for 23 years. He'd seen car accidents, hunting mishaps, bar fights gone wrong, and the occasional domestic dispute that ended in tragedy. But when he arrived at that cabin with his deputy, Marcus Chen, something felt fundamentally different. The air itself seemed wrong, heavy with an inexplicable tension that made both men hesitate before entering. The cabin was sparse. A cast-iron stove sat cold in the corner. Two cots lined the walls. A small wooden table held the remnants of a meal, bread gone hard and coffee frozen solid in tin cups. Everything suggested the men had been there for some time. But there were no supplies, no provisions beyond what sat on that table. The bodies themselves were well preserved by the cold. Two men in their 30s, both with dark hair and similar features. Brothers, the sheriff thought immediately. They were dressed in ordinary winter clothing, jackets and boots, nothing unusual. Deputy Chen knelt beside the first body. His name was later identified as Miguel Duarte, age 34. There were no visible injuries, no bruising, no cuts, no signs of struggle. The second body, his brother Carlos, age 31, was identical in appearance. No trauma. It was as if they had simply stopped living. The bodies were transported to the county medical examiner's office in the back of the sheriff's truck, wrapped carefully in blankets. Dr. Sarah Morrison had been the medical examiner for 8 years. She was methodical, precise, and prided herself on finding answers. When she began the preliminary examination that evening, she noticed something odd immediately. The bodies were unusually light, as if something essential had been removed. She started with Miguel. The external examination revealed nothing. She checked for needle marks, thinking perhaps they'd overdosed on something. Nothing. She looked for signs of carbon monoxide poisoning, which could explain the peaceful nature of their deaths. Nothing. When she made the first incision, her scalpel moved smoothly through the skin, and what she saw beneath made her pause. The subcutaneous tissue was pale, far paler than it should have been. She continued the Y incision, opening the chest cavity. Her assistant, a young man named Robert Hayes, stood ready with instruments. But as Dr. Morrison pulled back the tissue and exposed the internal organs, both of them froze. The heart, the lungs, the liver, everything appeared structurally intact, but something was profoundly wrong. She reached for the heart first, carefully extracting it. It should have been heavy, dense with blood even in death, but it felt hollow. She made an incision into the right ventricle, expecting the thick, coagulated blood typical of a corpse. Instead, there was almost nothing, a small amount of clear fluid, barely enough to coat her gloved finger. Robert leaned in closer, his eyes wide behind his glasses. Dr. Morrison moved to the liver next, then the spleen. Each organ told the same impossible story. There was no blood, not in any meaningful quantity. The Duarte brothers' bodies had been drained of the very substance that sustains human life, yet there was no evidence of how or why. Dr. Morrison worked through the night, unable to accept what she was seeing. She called in Dr. James Whitmore, a pathologist from Denver with 30 years of experience. He arrived at dawn, tired from the 2-hour drive through snow-covered mountain roads, but his fatigue vanished the moment he examined the first body. He performed his own independent assessment of Carlos Duarte, and his findings mirrored Dr. Morrison's exactly. Virtually no blood remained in the circulatory system. The two doctors stood in the cold examination room, the fluorescent lights humming overhead, and tried to make sense of the impossible. Dr. Whitmore had seen bodies drained of blood before, victims of severe trauma. People who had bled out from gunshot wounds or car accidents, but those bodies showed clear evidence of where the blood had gone. Massive external wounds, pooling at the scene, saturation in clothing. The Duarte brothers had none of that. Their clothing was clean, the cabin floor was clean. There was nowhere for the blood to have gone. Dr. Morrison suggested exsanguination, the medical term for severe blood loss. But exsanguination requires a mechanism. A severed artery, a deep laceration, something. They examined every inch of both bodies under magnification. They found no puncture wounds beyond a few old scars, unrelated to their deaths. No cuts, no tears in the skin. The bodies were intact. Dr. Whitmore proposed testing the remaining fluids for toxins. Perhaps some unknown poison had caused a catastrophic breakdown of red blood cells, essentially destroying the blood from within. They sent samples to the state laboratory in Denver. The results would take weeks, but it was the only lead they had. Meanwhile, Sheriff Blackwood began investigating the brothers' background. The identification had been challenging at first. The men carried no wallets, no identification, but their fingerprints were on file with the federal government. Miguel and Carlos Duarte had emigrated from Portugal in 1968, settling in Newark, New Jersey. Miguel had worked as a machinist, Carlos as a carpenter. They were quiet men, kept to themselves, paid their taxes, had no criminal records beyond a parking ticket. In 1974, they had left Newark without explanation. Their landlord said they gave a month's notice, paid what they owed, and drove away in a blue Ford pickup truck. No forwarding address. No one had heard from them since. The trail went cold until their bodies appeared in Colorado 2 years later. What had they been doing in that time? Why had they come to Leadville? Why were they in that remote cabin? Sheriff Blackwood reached out to their former employer in Newark, a man named Frank Castellano, who ran a machine shop. Frank remembered the brothers well. Good workers, he said. Reliable. But about 6 months before they left, Miguel had started acting strange. He became withdrawn, wouldn't engage in the usual shop floor conversation. He asked for time off repeatedly, offering no explanation. Carlos tried to cover for him, but eventually both brothers seemed consumed by something. Frank recalled one specific incident. He'd stayed late at the shop one evening, finishing paperwork in his office. He heard voices from the floor and walked out to find Miguel and Carlos standing near the loading dock arguing in Portuguese. Frank didn't speak the language, but the intensity was clear. Miguel looked gaunt, almost ill. When they noticed Frank, they stopped immediately. Miguel apologized, said they were dealing with a family matter. That was the last real conversation Frank had with them before they gave notice. Sheriff Blackwood asked if Frank knew of any family the brothers might have been dealing with. Frank shook his head. As far as he knew, Miguel and Carlos had no other relatives in the United States. Their parents had died in Portugal before they emigrated. They had no siblings, no wives, no children. They were alone. Back in Leadville, Deputy Chen was investigating the cabin itself. Property records showed it belonged to a man named Harold Gaines, a retired miner who lived in town. Harold confirmed he owned the cabin, but said he hadn't been up there in over a year. He sometimes rented it out to hunters or hikers for a small fee, cash only, no formal records. He didn't remember renting it to anyone matching the description of the Duarte brothers, but he admitted his memory wasn't what it used to be. Deputy Chen searched the cabin more thoroughly. Beneath one of the cots he found a small leather journal. The pages were filled with handwritten notes in Portuguese. He brought it back to the station, and Sheriff Blackwood arranged for a translator. The translator was a local teacher named Maria Sousa, whose parents had immigrated from Brazil. She sat in the sheriff's office, slowly working through the cramped handwriting, and what she translated made the sheriff's blood run cold. The journal belonged to Miguel Duarte. The entries began in March of 1974, about 3 months before the brothers left Newark. Maria translated carefully, her voice steady, but her hands trembling slightly as she turned the pages. The first entries were mundane. Miguel wrote about work, about the weather, about small frustrations. But in late April, the tone shifted. Miguel described feeling ill, severe fatigue, dizziness, a persistent weakness that no amount of rest seemed to cure. He went to a doctor, a general practitioner in Newark, whose name he didn't record. The doctor ran blood tests and told Miguel everything appeared normal. But Miguel knew something was wrong. He wrote that he could feel it, a hollowing sensation, as if something vital was being drawn out of him. By May, Carlos was experiencing the same symptoms. Miguel wrote with increasing panic. Both brothers were growing weaker. They tried different doctors, but each visit ended the same way. The tests showed nothing abnormal. One physician suggested it was stress, perhaps psychosomatic. Another recommended vitamins, but the brothers knew it was more than that. In June, Miguel wrote about a dream. He described standing in a vast empty field under a sky with no sun. He felt a pulling sensation, a force drawing something from deep within his chest. He woke gasping, his heart racing, and found Carlos awake as well, describing an identical dream. They began to believe something unnatural was happening to them. The journal entries became erratic after that. Miguel wrote about researching their family history, trying to find some explanation rooted in genetics or heredity. He mentioned letters sent to distant cousins in Portugal, asking questions about their parents, their grandparents. He described a growing obsession with finding answers. In August, a letter arrived from Portugal. Miguel didn't transcribe the letter's contents in full, but he summarized it. Their maternal grandmother, a woman named Isabel, had died under mysterious circumstances in 1942. The cause of death was officially listed as heart failure, but family whispers suggested something stranger. Isabel had been found in her bed looking peaceful, but when the local doctor examined her, he noted an unusual pallor, as if she'd lost significant blood despite no visible injuries. Miguel became convinced that whatever was happening to him and Carlos was connected to their grandmother. He wrote that they needed to leave Newark, to go somewhere isolated where they could figure out what was wrong without interference. They needed time, space, and distance from the noise of the city. Sheriff Blackwood listened as Maria translated, trying to process what he was hearing. A hereditary condition that caused blood loss without injury? It sounded like something from a horror novel, not real life. But the journal was real, the bodies were real, and the absence of blood was undeniably real. The journal entries from late 1974 described the brothers' journey west. They drove across the country, stopping in small towns, living out of their truck. Miguel wrote that they felt slightly better away from the crowds, but the weakness persisted. They researched medical libraries in the towns they passed through, looking for any documented cases similar to theirs. They found nothing. In early 1975, they arrived in Colorado. Miguel wrote that the mountains felt right, the thin air and isolation exactly what they needed. They heard about the cabin from a man in a Leadville bar, a place where they could stay undisturbed. They paid Harold Gaines in cash and moved in. For a while, the journal entries suggested improvement. Miguel wrote that they felt stronger in the mountains. The pulling sensation lessened. They began to hope they might recover. But by the fall of 1975, the symptoms returned with brutal intensity. Both brothers were growing weaker by the day. Miguel described waking up barely able to stand, Carlos too exhausted to leave his cot. The final entries were dated January 1976. Miguel's handwriting was shaky, barely legible. He wrote that they had accepted what was happening. There was no cure, no treatment. Whatever was taking their blood was beyond their understanding. He wrote a final message to anyone who might find them. He asked that their bodies be sent back to Portugal, to be buried with their family. He apologized for any trouble their deaths might cause. And then the journal ended. Maria set the journal down, her eyes glistening. Sheriff Blackwood thanked her and sat in silence for a long moment. He had a journal describing an impossible condition and two bodies that confirmed every word of it. But he still had no mechanism, no scientific explanation. He needed the toxicology results from Denver. 3 weeks later, the results arrived. Dr. Morrison called the sheriff immediately. The tests had found nothing. No toxins, no poisons, no chemical agents. The remaining fluids in the Duarte brothers' bodies were normal in every measurable way. The blood cells that remained were healthy. There was simply almost none of them left. The case attracted attention beyond Leadville. By March, word had spread to medical journals and research institutions. Dr. Morrison's report was reviewed by hematologists and pathologists across the country. Some suggested rare blood disorders like severe aplastic anemia, where the bone marrow fails to produce blood cells, but bone marrow samples from both brothers showed normal cellular activity. The mechanism for producing blood was intact. The blood itself was simply gone. A team from the Centers for Disease Control arrived in April. They were led by Dr. Ellen Fraser, a specialist in unexplained illnesses. She reviewed every piece of evidence, re-examined tissue samples, interviewed everyone involved. She spent 3 days in Leadville, methodically working through the case. On her last day, she sat with Sheriff Blackwood in his office and admitted she had no answers. Dr. Fraser explained that the human body contains approximately 5 liters of blood. Losing even 30% typically results in severe shock. Losing 50% is usually fatal. The Duarte brothers had lost nearly 90%, yet their bodies showed no signs of acute distress at the time of death. No elevated stress hormones, no indicators of panic or pain. It was as if the blood had been removed gradually over time, allowing the body to adapt until adaptation was no longer possible. But how? That was the question no one could answer. Dr. Fraser proposed internal hemorrhaging into a space that was later reabsorbed, but that didn't explain the sheer volume of blood missing. She suggested a rare parasitic infection that consumed blood cells, but no parasites were found. Every hypothesis led to a dead end. The story reached the media in May. Newspapers across Colorado ran headlines about the mysterious deaths. Some outlets sensationalized it, suggesting everything from government experiments to supernatural causes. Sheriff Blackwood refused most interview requests, but he did speak briefly to a reporter from the Denver Post. He kept the details clinical, emphasizing that the investigation was ongoing and that wild speculation helped no one. Meanwhile, Deputy Chen continued researching the brothers' background. He contacted medical researchers in Portugal, asking if there were any documented cases in the family history. A professor at the University of Lisbon responded with interest. He said there were old records, dating back to the late 19th century, of a family in the northern region experiencing unusual deaths. The details were vague, but the descriptions mentioned pallor and weakness. The family name was partially illegible in the records, but it could have been Duarte. Sheriff Blackwood found this information both fascinating and frustrating. It suggested a hereditary component, something passed down through generations, but even if it was genetic, that didn't explain the mechanism. Genes don't make blood disappear. They code for proteins, enzymes, cellular functions. What genetic anomaly could cause such a thing? In June, a private research foundation contacted Dr. Morrison. They specialized in rare genetic disorders and wanted to study the tissue samples. Dr. Morrison agreed, hoping they might find something everyone else had missed. The foundation's lead geneticist, Dr. Raymond Hu, worked with samples for 3 months. He sequenced portions of the brothers' DNA, looking for mutations or abnormalities. Dr. Hu found something, though he wasn't sure what it meant. There was a unique mutation in a gene related to hematopoiesis, the process of blood cell formation. The mutation didn't appear in any database of known genetic variations. It was entirely novel. But when Dr. Hu tried to determine what effect the mutation might have, he encountered a problem. The gene's function wasn't fully understood. It played a role in blood cell development, but the exact mechanisms were still being researched. Dr. Hu published a paper in a medical genetics journal describing the mutation and its potential connection to the Duarte brothers' deaths. The paper generated interest in academic circles, but offered no concrete conclusions. It was a piece of the puzzle, but the puzzle itself remained stubbornly incomplete. Sheriff Blackwood kept Miguel's journal in his office, returning to it periodically. He'd read it so many times he had passages memorized. One entry, from November 1975, stuck with him. Miguel had written about acceptance, about the strange peace that came from knowing there was nothing they could do. He wrote that he and Carlos had lived good lives, worked hard, hurt no one. If this was how their story ended, then so be it. The sheriff found himself thinking about that acceptance. In his line of work, He was used to fighting for answers, pushing until the truth revealed itself. But some truths, it seemed, remained hidden. The Duarte brothers had died from a condition that defied explanation, and perhaps that was simply the reality. Not every mystery had a solution, not every question had an answer. That didn't make the unknown any less real. By late summer of 1976, the investigation had reached what Sheriff Blackwood considered a standstill. The evidence had been examined, re-examined, and examined again. The journal had been translated and analyzed. Medical experts from across the country had weighed in with theories that led nowhere. The bodies of Miguel and Carlos Duarte had been released to a funeral home in Denver, where arrangements were made to have them return to Portugal, as Miguel had requested in his final journal entry. Sheriff Blackwood signed the paperwork personally, feeling it was the least he could do. But the case continued to haunt everyone who had been involved. Dr. Morrison found herself lying awake at night, running through the autopsy in her mind, searching for something she might have missed. Deputy Chen kept a copy of the translated journal in his desk drawer, reading passages during quiet moments at the station. Even the translator, Maria Sousa, told the sheriff that she thought about the brothers often, wondering what it must have been like to live with such a condition, knowing their bodies were failing in a way no doctor could fix. In September, Sheriff Blackwood received a letter from Portugal. It was written in careful English by a man named Father Antonio Ribeiro, a Catholic priest from the village where the Duarte family had originated. Father Ribeiro had heard about the case through relatives who still maintained contact with distant cousins. He wrote that he had been the parish priest for 40 years and remembered hearing stories about the Duarte family when he first arrived. The priest explained that the family had a reputation in the village, whispered about, but never openly discussed. There were stories of unexplained deaths stretching back generations, always the same pattern. A family member would grow weak over months or years, doctors would find nothing wrong, and eventually they would die. The bodies were always described as pale, drained of color. Some villagers attributed it to a curse, others to bad blood. But no one had ever found a medical explanation. Father Ribeiro mentioned that the village had a small cemetery where several Duarte family members were buried. He had occasionally visited the graves while tending to the church grounds. One grave in particular stood out to him. It belonged to Teresa Duarte, who had died in 1891 at the age of 28. The inscription on her weathered headstone read, "Taken by a mystery, resting in peace." He had always wondered what mystery the family had been referring to. Sheriff Blackwood wrote back to Father Ribeiro, thanking him for the information. He asked if there were any medical records or death certificates that might still exist from that era. The priest responded a month later, saying he had checked with the local civil registry office. Most records from before 1900 had been lost to fire or simply deteriorated over time. But he did find one document. It was a death certificate for Teresa Duarte. The cause of death was listed as anemia of unknown origin. The attending physician had noted that despite the apparent anemia, no treatments had been effective. Anemia. It was a word that kept appearing, but it didn't fully explain what had happened to the Duarte brothers. Anemia meant a deficiency of red blood cells, but it didn't mean those cells vanished entirely. Even severe anemia left some blood in the body. What Miguel and Carlos had experienced went far beyond anemia. Still, it was a connection, a thread that tied the present case to the family's past. In October, Dr. Raymond Hu from the Genetics Research Foundation contacted Sheriff Blackwood with an update. He had been collaborating with colleagues in Europe, including a geneticist at the University of Porto in Portugal. They had been trying to trace the genetic mutation Dr. Hu had identified in the Duarte brothers. The mutation was rare, but after searching through genetic databases, they found 2 other documented cases. Both individuals had been from northern Portugal. Both had died young, in their 30s, from what was described in old medical records as severe anemia. Dr. Hu explained that the mutation appeared to affect how red blood cells were maintained in the body. Under normal circumstances, red blood cells lived for approximately 120 days before being broken down and replaced. The mutation seemed to drastically accelerate the breakdown process while simultaneously impairing the body's ability to produce new cells at a compensatory rate. Over time, the affected individual would lose blood cells faster than they could be replaced. The end result was a slow, progressive depletion of blood. It was the closest thing to an answer anyone had found. The mechanism was still not fully understood, and there were gaps in the theory, but it provided a framework. Miguel and Carlos Duarte had likely carried this mutation, inherited from their family line. It had remained dormant or manageable for much of their lives, but something had triggered its activation in their 30s. What that trigger was, no one knew. Stress, environmental factors, age. It could have been any number of things. Sheriff Blackwood appreciated Dr. Hugh's work, but he couldn't help feeling that the explanation, while scientific, didn't capture the full weight of what had happened. 2 men had suffered and died, alone in a mountain cabin, aware that something was consuming them from the inside and powerless to stop it. The mutation was a label, a way of categorizing the unknown, but it didn't change the tragedy of their story. In November, the sheriff received word that the bodies had been interred in Portugal. Father Ribeiro sent a brief note confirming that Miguel and Carlos had been buried in the family plot, next to their parents and grandmother Isabel. A small ceremony had been held, attended by a few distant relatives and villagers who remembered the family name. Father Ribeiro had led the prayers and ensured the brothers were laid to rest with dignity. Sheriff Blackwood closed the case file officially in December. He wrote a final report summarizing the investigation, the medical findings, and the genetic research. He noted that while a probable cause had been identified, a rare hereditary mutation affecting blood cell production and maintenance, the exact mechanism remained incompletely understood. He recommended that the tissue samples be preserved for future study in case medical science advanced enough to provide further answers. The case was filed away, but it was never forgotten. Over the years, Sheriff Blackwood would occasionally receive inquiries from researchers or journalists interested in the Duarte brothers. He always provided what information he could, hoping that someone, somewhere, might find the missing pieces. In the spring of 1978, a medical researcher named Dr. Judith Keller read about the Duarte case in a journal article authored by Dr. Morrison and Dr. Hugh. Dr. Keller specialized in rare hematological disorders at Johns Hopkins University in Baltimore. She had spent her career studying conditions that fell outside the standard medical textbooks, the anomalies that defied easy categorization. The Duarte brothers' case intrigued her immediately. She reached out to Dr. Who, requesting access to the genetic data and tissue samples. Dr. Who agreed, and by early summer, Dr. Keller had begun her own analysis. She approached the case from a different angle than her predecessors. Rather than focusing solely on the mutation itself, she examined the broader genetic context. She looked at other genes that might interact with the mutation, regulatory elements that could influence its expression, and environmental factors that might trigger its activation. Dr. Keller discovered something interesting. The mutation that Dr. Who had identified was located on a gene that was normally suppressed in adults. It was primarily active during fetal development, playing a role in the initial formation of the blood system. In most people, the gene's activity diminished after birth, becoming largely dormant. But in individuals with the Duarte mutation, the gene appeared to reactivate in adulthood. When the gene reactivated, it interfered with the normal maintenance of red blood cells. It essentially sent conflicting signals to the body, telling it to break down blood cells at an accelerated rate while simultaneously impairing the bone marrow's ability to produce replacements. The result was a slow but inexorable decline in blood volume. Dr. Keller theorized that the reactivation might be triggered by specific stressors. She noted that Miguel's journal described the onset of symptoms coinciding with a period of increased work stress and anxiety. Carlos's symptoms began shortly after Miguel's, possibly triggered by the emotional stress of witnessing his brother's decline. Psychological stress, Dr. Keller hypothesized, might activate certain hormonal pathways that in turn reactivated the dormant gene. It was an elegant theory, and it fit the available evidence, but like all the theories before it, it was impossible to prove conclusively. The Duarte brothers were dead, and while their tissue samples provided valuable data, they couldn't answer questions about their lived experiences, their stress levels, or the environmental factors they had been exposed to. Dr. Keller published her findings in 1979, The paper was well received in academic circles, cited as a significant contribution to the understanding of rare genetic blood disorders, but it didn't bring closure to those who had been personally involved in the case. Sheriff Blackwood read the paper with interest, but it didn't change the fact that 2 men had died under his jurisdiction, and he had been unable to save them. Deputy Chen, who had since been promoted to sergeant, continued to think about the brothers. He had a habit of driving up to the cabin once or twice a year, usually in the summer when the roads were clear. The cabin was still there, weathered and empty. Harold Gaines had stopped renting it out after the deaths. He said it didn't feel right, profiting from a place where such suffering had occurred. On one of these visits in the summer of 1980, Sergeant Chen brought a small wooden cross and planted it in the ground outside the cabin. It wasn't a grave marker. The brothers were buried in Portugal, but it felt important to acknowledge what had happened there. He carved their names into the crossbeam with a pocket knife. Miguel and Carlos Duarte, 1976. It was a simple gesture, but it mattered to him. Back in Leadville, the story of the Duarte brothers became a local legend of sorts. People talked about it in hushed tones, particularly during the long winters when the mountains felt isolating and mysterious. Some versions of the story strayed from the facts, adding embellishments or supernatural elements that had never been part of the actual case. Sheriff Blackwood did his best to correct these distortions when he heard them, but he knew that once a story entered the realm of folklore, it took on a life of its own. Dr. Morrison retired from her position as medical examiner in 1985. In her final weeks on the job, she organized her case files, ensuring that everything was properly documented for her successor. The Duarte case occupied an entire box, thicker than any other file she had accumulated over her career. She wrote a cover memo summarizing the case and its significance, noting that it remained one of the most unusual and medically perplexing deaths she had ever investigated. She also included a personal note, something she rarely did. She wrote that the case had taught her humility. For years, she had prided herself on her ability to find answers, to provide explanations for the unexplainable. The Duarte brothers had shown her that some questions didn't have neat answers, and that was okay. Science was a process, not a destination. What they didn't understand today might be understood tomorrow, or in 10 years, or in a century. The important thing was to keep asking questions. In 1987, a television documentary series focused on unsolved medical mysteries featured a segment on the Duarte brothers. The producers interviewed Sheriff Blackwood, Dr. Morrison, and Dr. Keller. They filmed footage of the cabin, though by then it was in significant disrepair. The segment was respectful, avoiding sensationalism and focusing on the human element of the story. It introduced the case to a wider audience, and for a few months afterward, the sheriff's office received letters from people who claimed to have experienced similar symptoms or knew of family members who had died under comparable circumstances. Each letter was taken seriously. Sergeant Chen followed up on as many as he could, forwarding relevant information to Dr. Keller and other researchers. Most of the cases turned out to be unrelated, but a few showed intriguing similarities. Dr. Keller began compiling a database of potentially related cases, hoping that a pattern might emerge. It was slow work, hampered by incomplete medical records and the difficulty of tracing family histories across generations and continents. By the end of the decade, the Duarte case had become a footnote in medical literature, referenced occasionally in papers about rare genetic disorders, but no longer the subject of active research. The world had moved on, as it always does, to newer mysteries and more pressing concerns. The 1990s brought advances in genetic research that would have been unimaginable when the Duarte brothers died. The Human Genome Project, launched in 1990, promised to map every gene in the human body. Techniques for analyzing DNA became faster, cheaper, and more accurate. Dr. Keller, now a senior researcher at Johns Hopkins, saw an opportunity to revisit the Duarte case with these new tools. She contacted the facility where the Duarte brothers' tissue samples had been stored. Remarkably, the samples were still viable, preserved in liquid nitrogen. In 1995, Dr. Keller arranged for a comprehensive genetic analysis using sequencing technology that hadn't existed 20 years earlier. She assembled a team of geneticists, hematologists, and bioinformaticians to examine every aspect of the brothers' DNA. The analysis took 2 years. What they found was both illuminating and humbling. The mutation that Doctor Who had identified in the 1970s was indeed present, but it was not acting alone. The team discovered a cluster of related mutations across multiple genes, all involved in various aspects of blood cell production and regulation. It wasn't a single genetic defect, but a complex interplay of abnormalities that together created a profoundly dysfunctional system. Dr. Keller published these findings in 1997 in a paper titled Hereditary Progressive Exsanguination, a Case Study of the Duarte Brothers. She proposed a new name for the condition, one that captured its essential nature without resorting to vague terms like anemia or blood disorder. The name never gained widespread acceptance. The condition was simply too rare. But it gave researchers a framework for understanding similar cases. The paper concluded with a sobering observation. Even with the advanced understanding provided by modern genetics, there was no treatment that could have saved the Duarte brothers. The mutations were woven too deeply into their DNA, affecting too many systems. Gene therapy, still in its experimental infancy, might one day offer hope for future generations, but for Miguel and Carlos, born in the 1940s, there had been no escape. Sheriff Blackwood, retired since 1989, read Dr. Keller's paper with mixed emotions. He was grateful that science had finally provided a reasonably complete explanation, but it didn't erase the memory of standing in that cold cabin, looking at 2 bodies that shouldn't have existed, according to everything he thought he knew about death. He kept a copy of the paper in his desk at home, occasionally rereading it when he needed a reminder of why his career had mattered. Sergeant Chen, still serving with the Lake County Sheriff's Office, continued his annual visits to the cabin. By the late 1990s, the structure was collapsing. The roof had partially caved in, and the walls were leaning at precarious angles. The wooden cross he had planted was weathered, but still standing. He considered removing it before the cabin fell completely, but something made him leave it there. It felt like it belonged. In 2001, Father Antonio Ribeiro in Portugal passed away at the age of 86. His successor, a younger priest named Father Miguel Costa, found among Ribeiro's papers a collection of letters and documents related to the Duarte brothers. Father Costa read through them with fascination. He had heard stories about the case from older parishioners, but he hadn't realized how extensively Father Ribeiro had been involved. Father Costa decided to create a small memorial in the church. He commissioned a plaque that listed the names of Duarte family members who had died from the condition, as far back as records allowed. Teresa in 1891, Isabel in 1942, and finally Miguel and Carlos in 1976. The plaque included a brief inscription, "In memory of those taken by a mystery beyond understanding, may they rest in peace." The memorial was unveiled in a small ceremony in 2002. Several descendants of the Duarte family attended, though none carried the name anymore. The bloodline had been diluted through marriage and distance, and as far as anyone knew, no living relatives carried the mutations. Father Costa led a prayer service, acknowledging both the suffering the family had endured and the contributions their case had made to medical science. Dr. Keller attended the ceremony, traveling from Baltimore to Portugal specifically for the occasion. She spoke briefly, thanking the family for allowing researchers to study the case. She emphasized that while Miguel and Carlos's deaths had been tragic, their willingness to document their experiences in the journal had provided invaluable insights. Because of them, medical science understood a little more about the human body's complexity and fragility. After the ceremony, Dr. Keller visited the graves. The headstones for Miguel and Carlos were simple, matching those of their parents and grandmother. She stood there for a long time, thinking about the strange path her career had taken. She had studied dozens of rare diseases, published over 100 papers, trained countless students. But the Duarte case remained the one that had shaped her most profoundly. It had taught her that knowledge was hard-won, that answers were never guaranteed, and that sometimes the best you could do was bear witness to suffering and ensure it wasn't forgotten. Back in the United States, the Duarte case continued to be taught in medical schools as an example of a rare genetic disorder. Students learned about the complex interplay of mutations, the challenges of diagnosing conditions that fell outside standard medical categories, and the importance of thorough documentation. The case appeared in textbooks, usually in footnotes or sidebars, a cautionary tale about the limits of medical knowledge. In Leadville, the cabin finally collapsed in the winter of 2005. Heavy snow brought down what remained of the structure, leaving only a jumble of rotted timber and rusted metal. Sergeant Chen, now Lieutenant Chen, visited the site the following spring. The wooden cross was still there, half buried in debris. He extracted it carefully and brought it back to the sheriff's office, where it was placed in a display case alongside other artifacts from notable cases in the county's history. The plaque beneath the cross read, "In memory of Miguel and Carlos Duarte, whose lives and deaths contributed to medical understanding, found February 1976. It was a small commemoration, but it ensured that their story would be remembered by future generations of law enforcement officers who would walk through those halls. As the years passed into the 2010s, the Duarte brothers' case faded from active memory. Dr. Morrison had passed away in 2008, taking with her the first-hand knowledge of that cold February day, when she had made the first impossible discovery. Dr. Keller continued her research into rare blood disorders, but the Duarte case was no longer her primary focus. Sergeant Chen retired in 2012, ending a 40-year career with the Lake County Sheriff's Office. In 2015, a graduate student named Rachel Fontaine at the University of Colorado was researching historical medical cases for her dissertation on genetic anomalies in isolated populations. She came across the Duarte case while searching through archived medical journals. Something about it captivated her. She reached out to the Lake County Sheriff's Office asking if any original documents still existed. The current sheriff, a woman named Linda Morales, who had taken office in 2010, didn't know the case personally, but she asked her staff to search the archives. They found the original case file, remarkably well preserved, still in the box that Dr. Morrison had prepared decades earlier. Sheriff Morales contacted Rachel and arranged for her to visit Leadville to review the materials. Rachel spent 3 days in the sheriff's office, carefully reading through every document. She examined the translated journal, the autopsy reports, the correspondence with researchers in Portugal. She was struck by the thoroughness of the investigation and the humanity with which everyone involved had approached the case. These weren't just specimens to be studied. They were 2 men whose suffering had been taken seriously. Rachel's dissertation, completed in 2016, included an entire chapter on the Duarte brothers. She contextualized their story within the broader history of genetic research, showing how the case had contributed to the understanding of hereditary blood disorders. But she also emphasized the human element, the story of 2 brothers who had faced an impossible situation with dignity and acceptance. The dissertation was published by an academic press in 2017 and received positive reviews. It introduced the Duarte case to a new generation of medical researchers and historians. Several medical genetics programs began using it as a teaching tool, appreciating how it illustrated both the scientific process and the ethical considerations involved in studying rare diseases. In 2018, a filmmaker named Marcus Brennan read Rachel's dissertation and became interested in creating a documentary about the Duarte brothers. He contacted Rachel, who introduced him to the relevant researchers and the Lake County Sheriff's Office. Marcus spent a year researching, interviewing everyone still alive who had been involved in the case, and traveling to Portugal to film at the church and cemetery where the brothers were buried. The documentary, titled The Mystery in the Blood, premiered at a film festival in 2019. It was a thoughtful, measured examination of the case, avoiding sensationalism while still conveying the profound strangeness of what had happened. The film featured interviews with Dr. Keller, now in her 70s but still sharp and engaged. It included footage of the display case in the sheriff's office with the weathered wooden cross. And it ended with scenes of the Portuguese cemetery, the camera lingering on the simple headstones of Miguel and Carlos Duarte. The documentary received a limited theatrical release and was eventually picked up by a streaming service where it found a wider audience. People who watched it were struck by the same things that had struck everyone involved in the case over the decades: the mystery, the tragedy, and the unsettling reminder that the human body still held secrets that science couldn't fully explain. In 2021, Dr. Keller retired from Johns Hopkins after a distinguished career. In her final lecture to students, she spoke about the Duarte brothers. She described how the case had shaped her understanding of medical research, teaching her that knowledge was always incomplete and that curiosity had to be tempered with compassion. She told the students that Miguel and Carlos Duarte had given science a gift through their suffering, and that gift carried a responsibility to never stop seeking answers, but also to never forget that behind every medical mystery was a human being. Sheriff Morales, still serving Lake County in 2023, occasionally gave tours of the sheriff's office to school groups. She always stopped at the display case with the wooden cross and told the story of the Duarte brothers. The children would listen with wide eyes, some fascinated, some disturbed, all of them grappling with the idea that there were questions without answers. Sheriff Morales would remind them that uncertainty was part of life, and that it was okay not to have all the answers as long as you kept asking questions. The case file remained in the archives, available to researchers who requested access. Every few years, someone would reach out, a geneticist working on a related condition, a historian studying medical anomalies, a journalist writing about unsolved mysteries. Each new inquiry added another small piece to the legacy of Miguel and Carlos Duarte, ensuring that their story continued to resonate across time. In the end, the Duarte brothers' case became more than just a medical curiosity. It became a reminder of the complexity of human existence, the limits of knowledge, and the enduring power of mystery. Miguel and Carlos had lived ordinary lives, worked hard, hurt no one. They had faced an extraordinary affliction with courage and acceptance, and though they died alone in a mountain cabin far from their homeland, they were not forgotten. Their names lived on in medical literature, in documentary films, in the memory of a small Colorado town. They had become part of the story we tell ourselves about what it means to be human, fragile, mysterious, and ultimately unknowable. Their blood may have disappeared, but their legacy remained, written not in flesh and bone, but in the collective memory of everyone who had encountered their story and been changed by it. The mystery of the Duarte brothers endured, a testament to the profound and humbling truth that some questions may never be fully answered, and that perhaps that uncertainty is not a failure, but simply part of the human condition. Every family hides secrets, some so dark they should never see the light of day. Here, we open the doors to those shadowed pasts, uncovering hidden crimes, silent pacts, and stories that echo like ghosts through the halls of memory. If you've made it this far, it means you also carry that forbidden curiosity. So don't hesitate. Subscribe to the channel now, turn on the bell, and follow our next revelations. Because every day, new secrets emerge, and only those who dare to face the truth remain to hear them.